Okay, so let's get started. Welcome everybody this evening to the next installment in our series about great books made into great films with Mark Schenker. I'm Michael Bellicosa. I'm the head of adult programming here. I think most of you know that already. I think almost everybody, probably everybody knows a lot about Mark, so no time spent on the bio tonight. We have a lot to cover. I hope you had a chance to read the book, watch the movie, or do at least one of those things. And I just want to remind people that the next session is November. It's a Tuesday. That's why I'm reminding you. It's November. Uh, November 16th. Sorry, November 18th, a Tuesday. So this one was on Thursday because we had to kind of move the schedule around a little, but the next one is on a Tuesday. So just keep that in mind in the next few weeks. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark and we'll get started.
Thank you, Michael. I want to thank Michael, as always, for his invitation and for collaboration to the funders and to the library and to those of you who have shown up. As far as you're knowing a lot of things about me, the only really important thing to know is I'm a lovely person when you get to know me. That's it. So my goal in this series was to pick movies that you might know through the films that they generated, but not to have the series be about the films, although I'm always interested myself in seeing film versions of good books. My thinking and picking the books was to pick books with a strong genre component. So when we did the Maltese Falcon at our first meeting, we talked about the fiction, detective fiction. Rebecca, last time we talked about Gothic fiction. This evening, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Western as a genre. I want to say that it's impossible to overestimate how much the idea of the West, the idea of the frontier, the idea of cowboys, the idea and the genre of the Western as a book, as a movie, as a TV show, it's impossible to overestimate how much those things contributed to the formation of the American character. This book was the first novel by Walter van Tilburg Clark. He went on to write a good number of short stories in the 40s. This book was published in 1940, and he won the prestigious O. Henry Prize for short story writing 5 years in a row. He is in the Nevada, he's a Nevadan, Nevada Writers Hall of Fame, and he was very influential on establishing certain characteristics of the Western genre. It's sometimes referred to as a modern Western because it doesn't fit the conventional mode of cowboys versus Indians, Indians versus the cavalry, ranchers versus homesteaders, the completion of the railroad. A critic has said there are basically 7 plots in fiction, a Western fiction, and this is a kind of new one. What I want to stress about the Western is several things. First, the period that the West was wild is the second half of the 19th century, from 1849, when the gold rush sent a torrent of people from the East to the West, until 1890. That date is significant. That's almost 50 years, because that's the year that the Census Bureau in America officially stopped counting the frontier as its own population landscape for the purposes of the census. By 1890, the government's position was it's all one country. So if the Old West, if the Wild West, the frontier existed between 1849 and 1890, it's worth contemplating that the first Western novel was published in the first years of the 20th century by a Philadelphian called Owen Wister, Wister, who wrote a book called The Virginian. The first Western was not called The Oklahoman or The Texan. It was called The Virginian because its hero is a Virginia man who goes west. The key to understanding Western literature is to know that it's written for Americans in the East. It's written for people in Boston and Philadelphia and New York and North Carolina. The Virginian has the line in it, smile when you say that, mister, meaning you can say a nasty thing if you have some panache. And it has a school marm in it, and it sets a lot of the conventions of the West, from the Western. But if you're writing novels in the 1900s, including this novel in 1940, about America that existed only between 1849, the gold rush, and say 1900, you're writing about the past. So the first thing to appreciate about the Western, unless we're talking about new Westerns or spaghetti Westerns or a magnificent movie like Unforgiven, directed and starring Clint Eastwood, which spins on the Western. But if we're talking about traditional Westerns, if we're talking about the dozens of TV shows that populated the top 20 most popular shows in the 1950s, you could list at least half a dozen TV shows that were Westerns for the 1950s. They're always about the past. And the reason the 1950s embraced the Western on TV is that they were cheap and they were nostalgic. That was Eisenhower America. That was post-war. That was American values. Why not watch Gary Cooper or Lorne Greene and his sons, or The Rifleman, or Jim Arness, and on and on and on. The Western, by its nature, is retrospective. It's also elemental. They are almost always morality tales about this versus that. They can be simplistic sometimes. They can be elemental in the Stark sense, but they are almost always morality tales. And in this story, the conflict is between civilization and its opposite. And one of the hallmarks of this movie that you may have noticed is that people are rushing to form a posse. People are rushing to hang these men. People are rushing to get things done. And anyone who wants to delay, like Mr. Davies, who is not the judge, is not the sheriff, what does Mr. Davies do for a living? He owns the general store. He is a middle-class businessman. He is a bourgeois person. I don't mean that as a negative. That is, he has an interest in civilization because he owns a business. The people who want there not to be riots are the people who put boards over their windows in urban areas. Honesty is the best policy is a 19th century slogan invented by shop owners. The reason to be honest is not because God will love you or send you to heaven, or even that you'll have a clean conscience. The reason to be honest is it's better business. If you are an honest butcher, you will get more customers. Mr. Davies is not morally suspect. He's a good man. But his goodness derives not from being a preacher, that's Sparks, or the judge, we have a judge, or the sheriff, we have a sheriff, we have a deputy who's kind of suspect. The reason he's on the side of civilization is he's a shopkeeper. When Hitler mocked the British people as shopkeepers, he meant that they were bourgeois. And Winston Churchill strongly defended the idea that we may be a nation of shopkeepers, but that's what makes civilization. So civilization depends on taking time, having patience. In the novel, people are in a hurry to form a posse. They're in a hurry to hang these men. They wait until daylight. They're in a hurry once it is daylight to hang them, so much in a hurry that one of the horses accidentally gets frightened and hangs a man excruciatingly. That's Donald Morton, who has to be shot before he's dead. And time becomes a symbol of civilization. When they stop the carriage that has Rose Mapin in it, now Rose Swanson, you might think that that's an odd thing to happen, and it is in this wild wilderness. Here they meet this woman who's significant to Henry Fonda's character. I always forget this man's name, but you know who I'm talking about. And Swanson, the husband, gives this speech and says to the Henry Fonda character, I'm sorry to reference the movie instead of the novel, but I'll try to remind myself unless Michael wants to interrupt with the name of.
His name was Gil.
Gil, thank you. Yes, Gil. So Swanson says to Gil, I understand you had a relationship with her. I am happy after some time passes to invite you to our home in San Francisco. The hallmark is we're civilized people, but you can't visit her now because she has to get adjusted to domestic life. That is, she has to change from the loose woman she was. The women in town were worried about her. They sent her out to a civilized woman. She is, in the domestic sense, what Mr. Davies is in the commercial sense. Civilization depends on time. Time to make a posse, time to take these men in for justice, time to get used to being married. There's an old expression that says, truth is the daughter of time. The great detective fiction writer who went by the pseudonym Josephine Tey, Tey, she was Scottish, published a book in the 1950s called The Daughter of Time, in which her detective hero is laid up in a hospital bed and decides to use his free time to read English history. And while he's in bed, he solves the mystery of who killed the young princes in the tower when Richard III, one of the worst villains in English history and Shakespeare drama, was in power. And the idea is that time is needed in order to get to the truth. What do we know about the imagery of the West in popular culture? The gold rush was a rush. The Pony Express was interested in being fast, being quick. The idea of a great gunslinger was not that he was an excellent shot. They held contests to see who could shoot the center out of a $50. But the mark of a great gunslinger was not accuracy, it was speed. The quickest gun, the fastest gun in the West. The West is about time. Get to the land first, get the cattle to market on time, draw your gun quickly, get to the gold quickly, have a Pony Express that can set a new limit of speed. In contrast to that, civilization has to be deliberative. And that's the central conflict in the novel. There is no good reason, not morally and certainly not practically, that they could not have waited to bring these men into town. Now, of course, the author sets up a perfect moral dilemma, which is they not only got the wrong men, they got the wrong men for a crime that wasn't committed. Neither crime. They didn't rustle, and Larry Kincaid is not dead. In the movie version, they meet the sheriff on the way out, who tells them, and this happened, they meet the sheriff seconds after the three men have been hanged. Remember, I said it's a melodrama, so it's corny in that way. Not an hour later, not later that morning, seconds after they hang the men, they find out from the sheriff that Larry Kincaid is not dead. That's in the movie. In the film, in the novel, they find out from Larry Kincaid that he's still alive. The idea of melodrama, the idea that it's corny, the setting of the oxbow tree in the clearing where they find the men sleeping and then hang them. That tree, I think, is meant to invoke not just an oxbow, that is, the two curved wings, like the wood that goes over the back of a team of oxen, but also a kind of crucifix, a kind of cross. In Old English and Middle English, Jesus' cross was often referred to as a tree. And I think we're supposed to understand that this is a place where innocent men are going to be killed. It is a terrible set. It looks like what it is, a bad movie set. And one of the hallmarks of movies in America made during the war is that they were legally prohibited from spending more than a certain amount of money on production. And so almost every scene you see, except in the town, well, the town's a set too, but all the scenes of the stagecoach and the scenes around the campfire and the scene of the hanging and around the tree, that's all a set that was created with too little money. In fact, they had so little money from the limitations on what they could spend that they had to strike one set and take the materials to build another set for a later scene. This movie, the movie version of it, was nominated for Academy Award for Best Picture. It had the distinction of being one of the few movies that was nominated for Best Film and for no other Academy Award, not for director or acting or cinematography or writing, certainly not for set design. It lost in 1943 to a movie you might have heard of, Casablanca. But still, this little movie with terrible production values, but a couple of big stars. Dana Andrews was well known. Henry Fonda had made The Grapes of Wrath a few years before, where he has a everyman speech like the speech that he gives in reading Donald Martin's letter. He was a big deal. William Wellman, who directed the movie, was a big deal. But this little movie, 75 minutes long, not good production values. If you've seen the movie, you may have noticed that when the men come into town, the two drifters, a dog crosses their path from upper left to lower right. When they leave a day or two later, the same dog is there to cross the road exactly in the same opposite direction, same orientation. So it's not a great movie as a viewing experience as a film. The fact of Gerald's being someone who is effeminate, as the father says, I didn't want to raise any girl children with my name, is overdone, I think, but there it is. And the film has types like Mr. Davies as a type, Sparks, the African American preacher character, who's played by an actor named Lee Whipper, who lived to the age of 98 in the movie. He is African American. He was the first African American to join Actors Equity, and he founded the Negro Fund for Actors. He was one of the first founders. He was born before this novel takes place. The novel takes place in the 1880s. He was born in the 1870s. He lived 98 years to 1975. His role is crucial, and it matters probably that the preacher in this town that is not very spiritual is a black man. That is not a symbol of their open-mindedness. It's a symbol that they don't care about their preacher, that they would let a black man in Nevada in 1885 be a preacher. You may have missed that when you saw the movie, but I think it's quite intentional. He's the one who sings, you got to go to meet your maker, you got to go there by yourself. I believe that's an old American folk song called Death Don't Have No Mercy. And he's a very important character. And of course, he is one of the people who votes against the lynching. I know that's a lot of information, but I hope you'll digest a couple of key facts. It's a retrospective genre. It's always writing about the past, about a world that no longer exists when the novel is written. It's always starkly oppositional and sometimes melodramatic. And it is about civilization needing time, especially in this particular novel. I'll stop there and welcome any comments. First and foremost, please, about the novel. Michael, I'll let you direct traffic.
Sure. Okay, folks. Well, you know the drill. Use the Q&A to pose a question, make a comment. I'll relay them as I see them. One thing I wanted to ask you, Mark, just building on what you said about civilization requiring time, I think what's related to it is in civilization, you have things like due process proceedings, not spur of the moment, instant judgments. And you need time in order to run a due process proceeding.
Right. In fact, the word deliberate and deliberation is in a lot of laws. With all deliberate speed, says the Constitution. And what does a jury do? They deliberate. What does a judge do? He deliberates. That has implicit in it of being slow. And there's a real life objection when Thornley, the guy who is the friend and would-be avenger of Larry Kincaid, says he doesn't want to take a chance of bringing them back to town so somebody will let them off on some technicality. The fact of the Old West was if you were in the Nevada territory and you thought you had a man who killed an innocent person and you put him in the town jail, you might not have a U.S. Marshal come by for weeks. And if a marshal came by and it was decided that there were grounds to charge this person, you might not have a circuit judge come for a whole season. That person might have to be in the county jail, the local jail, the town jail for days or weeks or even months before they could have a trial. And if the person you arrested has a brother who's angry or a father who is connected, there's a good chance that they'll break him out of the jail and not wait for justice. That's the plot of a good John Ford movie with John Wayne called Rio Bravo and any number of Westerns. There's a real concern that the problem with needing time is that in the West, some things take too much time.
Yeah.
No one has comments or questions?
Not yet. Maybe people are typing away. So
Maybe
the other thing maybe I'll ask you about, Mark, I asked you about it before we started, is that if I'm right, that in the book, because of the attitude the sheriff takes, the bad people get away with it, whereas in the movie it looks like they don't. And I was wondering if that was because of the morality guidelines about the movie business.
Well, that's a good question. So in the novel, you know, those of you who read the book, that the sheriff famously says, I'm going to forget this ever happened. And we get the sense in the novel that in the same way his deputy is not to be trusted, neither is the sheriff. This is a clique of people who are going to keep this to themselves, a small town community. In the movie, the sheriff immediately says, and it's clear that he's a man of principle, God should have mercy on your soul because you're not going to get any from me. And of course, it's horribly shocking that these almost 20 people, all but 7, as Davy says, are guilty of a terrible rush to judgment. I think the reason it's different in the movie is partly what Michael is imagining correctly, I think, that the production code would not have wanted a figure of authority like the sheriff to be so morally corrupt. I think it's also that we're supposed to understand in the book that this is a bad town, a town that doesn't care. And you understand this is not my feeling, but the feeling of the community. Who's the preacher? They don't care. And they don't care who deputizes them for a posse. And they don't care that there may be good reason to wait. They don't want to wait. We're supposed to understand that the sheriff is not a good sheriff any more than the deputy is. This is a crappy town, you'll pardon me. That's a literary expression. That's what you understand from the book. And the book, by the way, also has, of course, a narrator in Art Croft, who is not the central of the two drifters, but the wingman, so to speak, even though he gets shot in his wing. So I hope someone has a question or comment now. Michael, how many people are in this Zoom room?
About 30.
All right, you can run, but you can't hide.
Well, I got one from Kate, who says, I appreciated the moral complexities presented in this novel and that it wasn't populated with white hat, black hat characters. I thought the narrator transmitted that moral tension very effectively. I also found the descriptions of nature and the rough terrain became another character.
Yes, and let me say that what drew many people to the West, Owen Wister, born in Philadelphia, he first traveled to the West for his health. It's not the only person that was true of. And for many Americans who had the money to do it, they went west for the landscape, for the natural beauty, for the flora and fauna. Sometimes they went as homesteaders. And of course, another tension between wilderness and civilization is the people who were in the West in the first part of the Old West were cowboys, based on the Spanish tradition of vaqueros. It's brought to America by the Spaniards. They were horse riders who tended cattle, broke horses, and moved herds of cattle around. They wanted an open range. And when homesteaders came and decided they wanted to take advantage of the government's offer after the Louisiana Purchase to buy land cheaply, they started using something, the invention of which you cannot overestimate, barbed wire. Barbed wire was used in whatever year it was created. I used to know, I don't know now, but it was in the 1800s early. And it's nearly invisible at a distance. It is painful to traveling herds. And it was a way that the homesteaders made their presence known to the cowboys. And that is an old battle between civilization, the people who want to plant crops. Think of Shane Van Heflin as a farmer, and those people like Jack Palance, who was on the side of the cattlemen who want an open range. Another example of civilization versus the wilderness. But Kate, your point about the description, he's a native Nevadan, and a great deal of the appeal of the Western frontier is that idea of its beauty. How many people's first experience of going west in America in the last 100 years was national parks? Any one of a number of national parks, the Grand Canyon and so on. People come back and they're eager to show you the pictures. I don't mean there aren't beautiful places in New England and the Deep South and the Midwest, but the far West has that reputation of being a beautiful landscape.
So I've got a question from Janet. If you're familiar with the novel, how do you compare or contrast this novel to Lonesome Dove?
So I think Lonesome Dove is a masterpiece. I think it is could never be rated highly enough. And I was delighted when it was made into a miniseries soon after it came out. I have a great respect for Larry McMurtry. Larry McMurtry resented the fact that he was always referred to in New York Times reviews and other critical appreciations of his work as a regional writer because he was writing about the American West. And that's a problem because many people, including maybe people in this room this evening, think of Western novels as a substandard kind of literature. But Lonesome Dove is a magnificent serial melodrama about a cattle drive with two very charismatic ex-Rangers, played beautifully by Tommy Lee Jones and Robert Duvall in the movie, in the TV movie, and beautifully directed. But there are people who turn their nose up because it's TV and it's a Western. But I will say that I think that's a beautiful novel that captures many of the hallmarks of what it means to be in the West. And there's a tension between Gus being called back by the Angelica Houston character to settle down and his being someone who can't settle down. Of course, eventually costs him his leg and then it costs him his life. If I'm spoiling the movie for you, I want to urge you to watch the movie. They're not 2 hours long, the 4 episodes. They're only more like an hour, 20 minutes, an hour and a half. It flies by. Beautifully acted and directed. Lonesome Dove, I think, is a great Western. Larry McMurtry so resented being called constantly a regional writer that in the bookstore that he owned in a town in Texas, he would be seen wearing a T-shirt that said, one of America's great regional writers. It's like when people say she's a terrific woman doctor.
Yeah, right. Right. Well, since Janet opened the door to comparisons to other works or other authors, how about what do you think about this in relationship to Cormac McCarthy?
Well, I'm going to say let's slow down a second, and we might need to talk more about this book unless people are out of ammunition, so to speak.
Well,
Because
I'm throwing stuff out there while people are either typing stuff or not.
but I'm going to say, in the spirit of truth is the daughter of time, let's wait another 3 minutes and not talk about Larry McMurtry or Cormac McCarthy, and ask if people don't have more to say about this novel. How did you feel about Major Tetley? How did you feel about um, uh, uh, Gill's role as a moral man who is an outsider? You know, he's the one who says, um, hanging concerns any man who happens to be around. I'd like to get more comment about this book, which I think is a very good book. It's not well written in the sense, the conventional sense that the prose matters. It's driven by plot, and it's driven by its philosophy of the need to be deliberate in thinking about taking three men's lives. And it certainly matters that one of them is senile, one of them is not American, as someone says, and the other one is impossibly suspect for all the bad luck he has. Just happens to be that he doesn't have a bill of sale. It just happens to be that he hasn't been to his own farm yet. It just happened that they found a gun that belonged to Larry Kincaid and so on. So is there no one else in the group who wants to say more about the Oxbow incident before we compare to other things?
Well, we can give them another couple of minutes.
Okay. You know, one of the fundamental tenets of American jurisprudence is the idea of innocent until proven guilty, and to try to find a middle ground always between majority rule and minority rights. And lynch mobs were certainly very characteristic, not just of the Old West, but the Deep South. There are people who have been lynched in Connecticut, and not, well, you don't have to go all the way back to 1885. Terrible thing, but it happened often. Stealing cattle, and especially stealing horses, was considered a capital offense because often it meant that the person whose horse he was stealing would die because he didn't have a way to get out of the wilderness. Stealing a man's horse was considered a capital offense because how essential horses were to survival in the Wild West, as we say.
Sure. Oh, let's see. Okay, Kate now says, I thought it was interesting that Ma, a woman, was part of this mob. I wonder how often women were portrayed as she is in the Western genre.
Yeah. Kate, I admire your comments from week to week. I just want to say, try not to use the word interesting. It's a mean nothing word. It has no meaning. So could you reframe your question and say what you think it is instead of interesting? Because you make an excellent observation. I know from past comments you're a good reader. If you would take that as a gentle correction, what do you think it is that she's portrayed the way she is? Interesting tells me nothing. And then I'll answer your question happily. It takes time to think of the right adjective, which is why we don't use the right adjective. It's why we use interesting.
Well, how about this? I'll throw another one at you while Kate's thinking of that.
Go away.
Liz, oh, here we go. Kate says, a woman in an active role, not a passive one.
Yes. So, Kate, and I wasn't flattering you in order to get you to change your word. I can tell you're a good reader. So, you may have noticed that in the movie version, Gerald is wearing plaid. And the only other character in the posse wearing plaid is Ma, Jenny, whatever her name, Jenny, Ma Jenny, whatever her name is. And she's played by Jane Darwell, who plays Mother Jode in Grapes of Wrath, plays the mother to Henry Fonda in a movie made 3 years before. In the movie, she is a non-feminine woman. It's not just that she's the only woman in the posse. She laughs like a witch. She sets out the meal that becomes like a picnic. She's one of the people who's happy to hit the horse. She is what you might call a denatured female. That is, a female who doesn't fit the standards of either 1885 or 1940. Her counterpart is Gerald, who's a denatured male. I'm not talking about my values, I'm talking about the expectation of people. He's not a man. He doesn't want to kill. He doesn't want to hit the horse. He has no facial hair. He is an effeminate man whose father castigates him as a female child. And he's wearing a plaid coat in the same way that Jane Darwell, Ma, is wearing a plaid coat as a denatured woman. That is, they are outliers in a civilized world because the civilized world of the Old West doesn't have a category for sensitive boys or rugged women. The other female character who's present in the movie is Rose Mapin, so much so that they have her to impossibly cart her into a middle of the night scene in a stagecoach because they have to have her on the set. And what's the point that's made about her? She is an ultra-sexual female, not the beloved wife of the homesteader in something like Shame, but a threat to other people's marriages. That is, she's a destabilizer of civilization, but that's a mainstay in the West. The barroom girls were usually prostitutes, even though we didn't think about them when we see Gunsmoke and Miss Kitty. But they're not just dancing to music, they're taking men upstairs and having sex for pay. But that's a type that's known to be part of what civilization needs. They need a whorehouse. Rose Mapin is then domesticated by becoming Rose Swanson, and she's no longer a threat. And when she gets used to her role as a civilized woman, in quotation marks, her husband says, "You can come to San Francisco." I think the movie and the book are very smart about how gender categories operate. The world would be better, the world's getting better, if civilization had a space for men who don't want to kill or be bullied by their father, and for women who want to be able to ride out with the boys and cackle and even be bloodthirsty. But it wasn't ready in 1940.
We got a comment from Liz. I think that one of the significant differences between the novel and the movie was the resolution/deaths of Major Tetley and his son.
Yes.
The son who survives in the movie, but not in the novel.
Right. Again, I appreciate these good comments. So, of course, those of you who've only read the novel know that the son takes his life by hanging, guilty for what he's done, and the father, learning of that, kills himself with his cavalry sword. It's worth noting that Major Tetley did not participate in the Civil War. He was nowhere near it. Probably, they say, only went south after the war was over. Remember, this is 20 years after the end of the war. And it's worth noting what many people miss. He's not a general. He's not even a colonel. The South was lousy with colonels, and not just Kentucky Fried Chicken colonels. That he was a major is a very low rank relative to what the leaders of the Confederacy were. And I've read many reviews of the novel and the movie that incorrectly call him a Confederate general because people are so habituated to being generals. So in the novel, there is a double suicide, and It's very poignant, and you make your own judgment about what you make of Major Tetley, that he kills himself not because of his complicity in the kangaroo court, but his son's death. In the movie, as Lynn said, Tetley goes into a closed room and off camera shoots himself. The production code forbade depictions of suicide. It was considered one of those things that was morally reprehensible. You did not want to encourage people to be suicidal. And the movie leaves the son standing on the porch next to one of the southern columns, looking despondent and leaving it to the viewer to guess what his next step is. I believe that he probably kills himself, not because his father killed himself, but because he just can't live with his borderline complicity in this miscarriage of justice. In the movie, also, the two drifters, Harry Morgan and Henry Fonda, decide that they're going back to Martin's farm to help his widow raise her children. They're very, very clear about that. They donated money, they collected money from the men. You have to multiply the values in this movie of dollars by something like 36 to understand how much money is being talked about here. And they ride off with the idea that they're going to become guardians to Dana Andrews' now fatherless children. That does not happen in the novel. In the novel, Gil can't get out of town fast enough because it's a bad town. It's a bad town. Michael, can you give me a time check just for my sake?
Yep, it's 13 minutes to 8.
Okay, so I don't want to be tough anymore. If Michael, you have a question about comparing this to another Western or novel, or anyone else does, I don't want to be a bully. As I said, I'm really quite nice when you get to know me. So, Michael, do you want to repeat your question? I'll do my best with it.
Well, I had two things. One was a comment, the other one was a question. You can decide what you want to talk about. The other dichotomy in your descriptions about civilization versus its opposite, aside from taking time and being deliberate and all of that, is that you think about the homesteaders versus the range people. It's one side wants to live in a world where there's rules that you follow and everybody else follows the rules, and the other one doesn't want to follow any rules.
Yeah.
And that's similar to what's got the dichotomy in this movie, because the lynchers don't want to follow any rules, and the civilized people are like, no, there are rules about this. You get the guy charged, and then you have the.
So let me say this about that comment, and then I do want to invite you to repeat what you originally said about whatever novel you wanted to compare it to. I want to come back to that. But here's the thing. America had a frontier. It had a frontier in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Hawthorne writes about if you step outside of town and go into the woods, there's trouble. There are witches, there are demons. Stephen Sondheim knew that no good could come from going into the woods. Going into the woods was scary. And the experience of the settling of America was that here's civilization around the town square, and 2 miles away in the thicket of the woods, there's chaos. You might not know this, but very few nations had frontiers. England never had a frontier. England didn't have an experience that the people who lived in London were civilized and the people who lived 2 miles out were not. Londoners may have looked down their nose at other people, but the idea of a frontier is American, not uniquely American, but distinctly American. And in line with what you're talking about people who hold to a standard and people who don't, if you're someone who's used to living on a frontier, whether it's to say, when I go out of town, I don't know what I'm going to find. I'm going to find highwaymen, people killing me on the road, no law and order outside of this line. If I cross over this barbed wire, I'm in somebody's garden plot and not an open range. If you're someone who believes in boundaries or wants to cross a line, it matters that you're in a country that has a line. It's called the frontier. And once you get past St. Louis or name your town, if the railroad has stopped, if the Pony Express doesn't go into Nevada, that's the wilderness. And in a country that has people who are interested in pushing the envelope, crossing the line, testing exceptions, it matters that this country was raised on having a line. And I think for people who study the West, that's a very big part of the psychology and culture of Western literature.
Great point.
What was the novel you wanted?
The other thing I was just wondering about, either specifically the novel Blood Meridian or just Cormac McCarthy in general.
Yeah. So Cormac McCarthy is an extraordinarily gifted writer, a true genius, and he's not writing a Western in any conventional sense. Blood Meridian has as its protagonist a man who can't read but carries a Bible around with him. He is a force of nature. He is bloodthirsty. And Cormac McCarthy, for that novel and several other novels, including No Country for Old Men, a magnificent novel that reads like a screenplay, was charged with being so violent, like Quentin Tarantino in movies, that he couldn't be a great writer. But his argument was that that kind of violence was central to the myth of the West. And then something happened to him later in life when some years ago, but later in his career, he published a novel called The Road that was made into a movie, a good movie with Viggo Mortensen as the father. And if you haven't read the book and you haven't read the novel, I make no apologies for a little spoiler, which is people who read that book, which is about a father and son making a journey looking for civilization when the world has been decimated or worse by a nuclear holocaust. The world has ended, but there are stragglers that remain. Just 2 nights ago, I did the novel published in 1953 by Ray Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451, which has a group of people at the end after a nuclear holocaust trying to rebuild civilization by memorizing classic books and becoming those books. I'm sure many of you know that book. Well, people read The Road and thought, oh, Cormac McCarthy is a Western writer who's bloodthirsty and he has this weird idea that everything is violence. And they misread the novel. You don't write a novel and call it The Road unless you think there's a place to go to. He didn't say the frontier, he said the road. And the road tells you that Cormac McCarthy, late in his career, relatively speaking, is interested in the possibility of redemption. And the reason, I believe, is because between Blood Meridian and No Country for Old Men and The Road, he had a baby boy, he had a son. And I think becoming a father changed his view and said, it's not just enough to have a frontier, you have to be going somewhere. Some years ago, I taught a course in American literature. I wasn't trained in American literature. I kind of backed into it. That was called Pilgrims and Pioneers. And the premise of the course, not original to me, was that there were 2 kinds of Americans as types, of many types. One was the pilgrim, the adventurers who formed the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Rock, the Mayflower. Pilgrims had as their interest God and spirituality, and as their name suggests, they were going somewhere. They were on a pilgrimage, and it's a very strong American type. Still in New England, it's one of the reasons why Yale University was founded by Congregationalist ministers. It's one of the reasons why Harvard and other colleges have a Christian background. Pilgrims had a place to go. And in The Road, the father and son are on a pilgrimage. But another kind of American type is the pioneer. Daniel Boone, David Crockett, the Alamo, John Wayne, fill in. Pioneers were not going somewhere with a spiritual dimension. It had nothing to do with religion. It had to do with self-enhancement. It had to do with making money. It had to do with a sense of adventure. It had to do, going back to Kate's point, with exploring the wilderness. To be a pioneer is to be the first person to bring something like civilization to the wilderness. Completely different dynamic. And if someone brought you into a room with a conference table, and there was a pilgrim type, not wearing the hat with the bucket, the buckle, that gives it away. But if you were talking to someone whose nature was to be a pilgrim and someone else whose nature was to be a pioneer, you would know in minutes which was which. They are two different but coexisting American types. And that's part of what your question raises about Cormac McCarthy. He was a kind of pioneer in the savagery with which he depicted the American West, and then he became a kind of pilgrim. You may know that in many of his movies, John Wayne called the people he was talking to pilgrim. Well, you better listen and listen tight, pilgrim. And he meant pilgrim. It's what he called James Stewart in the movie The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. He's demeaning them as not a true Western type, as a spiritual type, someone on a mission. James Stewart's character is that he wants to be a lawyer and he becomes a senator for the state that they're in. Very un-John Wayne-like, but John Wayne turns out to be willing to be domesticated.
Super.
The Marlboro Man was a marketing based on the West, based on cowboys, and I'm sure there are men who bought those cigarettes who'd never been away from Rhode Island, for example.
Amazing. So there's a quick question which is not on our top. Well, it's on our topic, but it's just someone asking about what the future of books and movies are. So I can just answer that quickly.
Sure, easy question. How's it framed?
Oh, it says what are the next movies in November, December?
I'm sorry, the movies? You mean the novels? I'm getting confused.
No, this person's just asking like, what are we covering in the next few sessions?
Oh, you want to be reminded of the syllabus?
Yes, that's it's. Oh, and then we do have another question. So let me answer the first thing just quickly to get that out of the way. The next one we're covering on November 18, Strangers on a Train. Then December 2, The Old Man and the Sea. And then the final one on December 16th, 2001, A Space Odyssey.
Yeah, and in general, those genres are psychological, thriller, adventure, sea adventure, and science fiction. Okay, go ahead, Michael. What's the other thing?
So Kate's got another comment, says, I think the blurb on the cover of my edition of this novel is particularly apt for our discussion series. Quote, the Oxbow incident bears about the same relation to an ordinary Western that the Maltese Falcon does to a hack detective story. So says the New Yorker.
Wait, that's a blurb on it?
That's a blurb on the cover of her book from the New Yorker.
Hey, your book references the Maltese Falcon?
Apparently so.
I'm a genius. All I can say is I'm a genius. Kate, thank you for that. I think that's absolutely apt, but I would not have thought of that. Thank you. Yeah, that's impressive.
Synchronicities breaking out everywhere.
So again, one of the things about genre fiction is taken to its extreme in a novel like The Maltese Falcon. You can say that the characters are types, they don't really have an interior life. So Miss Wonderly or the men who conspire to Sidney Greenstreet and Peter Lorre's characters, they're not complicated people. They're avaricious. They are homicidal. You can't think of them as three-dimensional characters. Even Sam Spade, who's more complex, is a type because the nature of genre fiction is to have characters who move the plot. And you can decide when you read a book like Strangers on a Train how much the characters in that novel, and it's significantly different in some ways from the movie, the great Alfred Hitchcock movie, or how different the characters in Rebecca are from the movie, how much they're types. Clearly, the housekeeper in Rebecca is a genre type. She is a stereotype of a kind of person. You could do a psychoanalysis of her, but it's hard when you read it not to think of her as a type. The same thing's true. The characters in science fiction are typically not morally complex, also in Western. But when you see a Western like Unforgiven by Clint Eastwood, now an old movie, but when it first came out, it was striking that its hero, played by the man who directed the movie, Clint Eastwood, who you know is a good guy, because his best friend is Morgan Freeman. He is a killer of women and children in his past life, and he's getting back on the saddle to make money for a reward and will kill men who are presumed guilty, but he's not going to over worry bad. Morally ambiguous Westerns came into the world in the 60s and 70s with the so-called spaghetti Westerns that Clint Eastwood made his fame in before he became an American movie star. And what made them morally suspect was you didn't know what color hat this guy had. The man with no name is not someone who's a member of society. He has no name. And one of the things about having a name is it claims you to your family, to your region. That's why cattle are branded. They are domesticated with a brand, and we get brand name from things like Jello, from branding cattle. And you may not know that in the West, there was a rancher with a lot of cattle who did not like the idea of inflicting pain on his cattle. So he refused to brand his animals, and other ranchers were very upset with him, but he stuck to his guns, and his last name was Maverick, Maverick, which is where you get the word for someone who doesn't play by the rules, a guy who wouldn't brand his cattle.
Interesting. The other thing I'll just mention, since we're probably getting ready to wrap it up, I can't find a citation, so I can't swear on this, but I believe I have heard and seen that Clint Eastwood has said that this is his favorite movie.
I think I also have read that he's an admirer of the movie. I'm not sure I remember his favorite, but it wouldn't surprise me. I could see why it would appeal to him. Yeah. And it's worth considering, ladies and gentlemen, as we wrap up. I think we must be near the top of the hour.
Yep.
That it's something that for a movie that wasn't nominated for its writing, its acting, its cinematography, its set design, or anything else, was nominated in the 1940s for Best Picture of the Year. Extraordinary nod to the movie, and no shame in losing to Casablanca. But that's remarkable that people thought the movie as a movie in its totality was worthy of that nomination. And that was back in the day when there were only 5 nominees, not 10 or 15 as there are today.
Right, sure.
So next time, Strangers on a Train, if you only know it through the very good movie by Alfred Hitchcock, I urge you to read the novel before you watch or rewatch the movie, because the novel has important differences, including what one of the men does for a living, which is made a big deal of in the movie and is quite different in the novel. I hope you're enjoying the premise of this series, which is you have a movie to go to if you like, but our focus is always on the text and the genre. And next time, it's psychological thriller, just in time for Halloween tomorrow.
Sounds great. Looking forward to reading it, which I have not done before. So thanks, everybody, for attending and participating. Looking forward to our next one in a few weeks. Remember, it's on the Tuesday, not the Thursday next time.
Thank you, Michael. And thank those of you who contributed, and even multiple times. I always appreciate the insights, and I'm not just being polite. Good to have people comment. Take care, everybody. Stay dry.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening. See you, Mark.
Bye, Michael. Thank you.